Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good evening, namaskar, depending on where you are. I am Udayan Singh. I am a postdoctoral appointee at the Argonne National Laboratory, although I am co-moderating this event strongly in my individual capacity. We are joined, as I said, we are in different time zones, several time zones. We have 4 speakers ranging from Dr. Kirit Parikh ji, who is in India, where it is 7:30 in the evening, to Ms. Amy Ains, where in California, where it is 6 a.m. So and of course Sarah Lazarovich and Celeste Renaud in between. So we are grateful to all our speakers for making it convenient to attend this session. This event is being sponsored by the American Geophysical Union Sharing Science Grant, and we reached out to them with a proposal on organizing this panel on how we could communicate about climate change to diverse audiences, and they very generously agreed to sponsor us. So we thank AGU for their generous support and trust. I'll be co-moderating this event, as I said, with my friend Linnea Sabi, who is a PhD candidate at UVA, and of course, you know, the most of the credit for this event goes to Linnea, Kat Osik, and Samarth Singh. So they have done most of the heavy lifting, and I think it's most credit goes to them. Before we get started, I just want to say a few opening logistic sort of suggestions, such that this panel can go on more smoothly and we can leverage all the expertise which we have both in the panelists as well as the attendees. We'll request all the panelists to give their opening remarks for about 7 to 8 minutes. Then after that, there will be an opportunity for the panelists to interact with each other for about 8 to 10 minutes to respond to each other if there are some pressing remarks they want to deliver. After that, we'll open the floor for questions to the audience. You may feel free to raise your hand on Zoom and ask your questions, or you could put it in the chat box. So please note that we are recording this session. So if you wish your name or voice not to be disclosed, please put your question in the chat box, or else, once you raise your hand, we'll call out your name and then you can ask your questions. So yeah, with that, I would request Linnea to get an overview of why we are organizing this panel and the theme of this session.
Thanks, Udayan. Thanks everyone for being here today. I've been looking forward to this event. As Udayan said, I'm Linnea Sabi, a PhD candidate and founder and president of Virginia Scientist Community Interface, which is also co-hosting this event. So we're here today to talk about climate change communication, which includes balancing scientific accuracy with relevance to people's everyday lives, balancing the immense urgency of the issue without sliding into climate alarmism. And as I'm sure many of us are aware, good communication on this issue is a really key part of increasing public understanding and building momentum for coordinated global action on climate change. So the goal of this panel is to bring viewpoints from both communications and science experts together in the same panel to create a set of recommendations that's helpful to anyone who is communicating about climate change. So we're extremely pleased to welcome this panel of esteemed experts. Their complete bios are available on the event webpage, which I will post to the chat now. And we'll provide some brief introductions before each speaker. So without further ado, I will give it back to Udayan to introduce our first speaker. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Linnea. That was a very comprehensive introduction. Our first speaker is a very distinguished energy economist from India, Dr. Kirit Parikh Sahab. He was member Planning Commission of the Government of India, has been conferred the Padma Bhushan, which is the 3rd highest civilian honor of the Government of India. I'm very inadequate to provide a full formal introduction. I just want to say that Dr. Parikh has provided policy guidelines to senior level policymakers all the way up to prime ministers of India. And so we are really grateful that you were able to join us, sir. So, sir, we want your insights on 2 particular things. The first is energy and climate. These kind of things are very, very complex issues. When you communicate these intricacies to senior level policymakers, what are some advices or tips we should follow? And the second is, of course, sir, you represented India at UNDP, at EASA. You were the bridge between India and EASA for such a long time. So when you represent India or a developing economy context, how do you communicate the difficulties of transitioning to a low carbon economy? So without further ado, I would request sir to provide your opening remarks in roughly 8 minutes. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, let me start my timer and I will talk. Thank you very much for this introduction. I have had a number of occasions when very complex analysis of problems we had to convince people, particularly policymakers, to how to say it. When you are doing scientific work and trying to explain the scientific models are by necessity fairly complex, particularly when you are talking about climate change. And the trick is, in a sense, to really try to make this simple, complex models, bring it down to the essence of it and make very simple models out of it, which really captures and says, okay, because everybody has some kind of a model behind it. It may be a mental model, it may be simple, few equation model, or things of that kind. And if you can reduce your complex analysis to these deeply held inner beliefs, or I would almost say the mental model of people, then they would follow that, yes, this makes sense, this is how it happens, and this is what is happening. As far as the climate change issue is concerned, I think the evidence that for it is really so large that unless you are you've decided to not listen to anything, I think it should be relatively easy to say that, yes, the world is going through very serious problems of climate change, that the frequency and intensity of extreme events are increasing all around the world. And the evidence is in a sense overwhelming. But if somebody who doesn't want to listen to you, what in India we say that a man who is awake sleeps twice as hard. And it's absolutely impossible to persuade them because they just don't want to listen. They have made up their mind, whatever of little they have of it, and they don't want to listen to you. So there is very little one can do about it. But I think when you are trying to persuade policymakers to really about some policy, some actions, then I think there are many things that one can do which are of, I think, importance. It seems to me that politicians have a much wider set of constituents that they should really, they're looking after their interests. So if you are suggesting a policy change, then you must tell them what is really the impact on the different stakeholders in this area. So for example, some years ago in India, we had putting a very distorted price of diesel. And when we said that diesel price should be rationalized, we did a study, but we presented it in a way that said, okay, if you don't increase diesel price, there will be short-term inflation, but in a longer term, you would lose a lot of economic growth. That it would have a very minimal impact on consumers, even the poorest one in the lot. It would have a very small impact on the truck drivers who are really ferrying goods and so on. So we pointed out the impact on all the different consumers, different stakeholders that would be affected by the policy change. And we're happy to say that the government did listen to us and eventually did liberalize diesel price. But the same thing applies to other areas also. If you're saying, okay, we need to do some adaptation, then you have to think about who are the people who are affected by it, do a proper analysis of it, and present it in a way that the politicians can understand it and say, look, here is the impact on small farmers, middle farmers, large farmers, the traders, the shopkeepers, and so on, and the transport people. So if you do that, then I think it is possible for this, because some good will lose something. And you have to suggest that, yes, you need to have certain policies to compensate people who are losing, because and all policies have some impact on people, which really have some adverse impact on at least some group or other. Otherwise, it would not have been there as a policy in the first place. I think if I come to the second issue about climate change, how do we promote equitable development? I mean, if equitable policies to deal with climate change. The trouble with this is that adaptation is something politicians can easily understand, and whether it is all essentially a local policies. So the state, so an analysis that tells you the impact on different stakeholders, they might be able to, they will understand, and hopefully will take some actions. But as far as mitigation is concerned, an individual country can do very little, maybe barring one or two United States and China. Most countries by themselves cannot really deal with the mitigation problem. But what we have to do is, realize, first thing is that people have to recognize that there is an understanding globally of what we call common but differentiated responsibility and corresponding to respective national circumstances. But unless people accept their responsibility of having contributed to climate change, it is very difficult to make them pay. And unfortunately, it is only the very rich and the powerful who have contributed to the problem of climate change, and they are very reluctant to give money to others to deal with it. And that's what we have seen. All promises are made, and and for want of a global governance mechanism, it's very difficult to enforce this. We had the Kyoto Protocol, didn't work, and all these things because countries refuse to live up to their commitments and their things. They can commit anything, but they don't have any responsibility to make sure that they live up to this. And of course, they can always say, yes, I did this. The politician can say, I agreed to this, but my parliament, my Congress doesn't agree to this. And what can I do? My hands are tied up. And that's the problem that we run into it. Now, I think the first of all is we have to make sure that people accept some responsibility. Now, that is extremely difficult. So one suggestion that we have made is that you could really think about saying that climate change is caused by the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. From 1990 onwards, no country can claim that they didn't know about climate change because the preparation for the Rio conference started. And therefore, all countries are responsible for their emissions from 1990 onwards. So we could say, suppose we put a small tax of even $1 per ton of cumulated carbon space that they have occupied per year from all countries, rich and poor, the small and big, developed and developing, then it will be equitable in some sense, and yet we will collect enough money. Something like, in 2002 based emissions, we could collect something like $700 billion a year. So there is really no issue about trying to find adequate resources from that point of view. That money, part of it can be given back to the countries themselves, saying, we will compensate you for your climate action, mitigation action from this. So then they will have some incentive to do this. So I think one needs to think about some creative solutions, but think about how we can make equity here Otherwise, one always says, I don't want to reduce it because India and China are going to increase their emissions. That kind of excuse should not be there, because then you are saying everybody is being taxed. And if you're taxing that, then what happens? The stock of this, that will have other advantages, that it will incentivize countries to postpone their emissions, and also it will incentivize them for doing negative emissions. I think I've taken up enough of my time, and so I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments, Dr. Parikh. It's my pleasure to next introduce Amy Ains. Amy is a messaging strategist, speaker coach, and accomplished presenter, and is currently founder and CEO of Damianakis Communications. In her career, she has managed marketing and technical communications and worked as a spokesperson. With the launch of her book, Championing Science, Ms. Ains is currently focused on helping scientists communicate with impact. So without further ado, please take the stage, Ms. Ains.
Well, I couldn't miss this. And it's in large part because climate anxiety is so real right now. You may know there was a study done by 5 universities, 10 countries, 10,000 people, ages 16 to 25. And the data from that really, really underscores how scary things have gotten. 4 out of 10 of these people said they're hesitant to have children, to bring them into this world. 56% said humanity is doomed. 45% say that these fears, the anxiety that this is producing for them, is with them and affects their lives daily. So it's no surprise, you just heard that governments aren't really stepping up, they're not taking responsibility. And for me, it's an imperative for all of you, and I'm glad you're here today, because I think there's some things to understand about how to communicate, how to get attention around this topic. And they go beyond just the way we use words, and they touch on the importance of understanding how people think. And I want to share with you a quote that has really stuck with me ever since I heard it. It was from Chris Volpe, who runs an organization called Science Counts. And Dr. Volpe said this: human beings are feeling beings who think, not the other way around. They're not thinking beings who feel. We feel first. Some of us who are very analytical and technical probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about what we're feeling, but we feel first. And that is a really key ingredient for getting the attention of the people that you're talking to, is creating a connection with them. So it's important to think about that. And it's important to strategize anytime you get a chance to communicate. It's really important to strategize and to be clear about your goal. Are you informing? Are you educating? Are you trying to persuade a policymaker? What are you working to accomplish? What's the best way to do that? So anytime you need to go into a situation to try to make an impact, you need to do a lot of thinking about it in advance. And my motto has long been that words really matter. What you say, how you say it, when you say it, all of that matters. And it's important to think about it in advance. So all of you have the opportunity to be strategists and translators, as you just heard. Take the complex and simplify it. So I want to share with you just two elements of materials that where did they go? Materials that I work with on a regular basis, and take you through just a couple of key concepts. And the first one, give me a minute here. The first one is to play to your listeners. Play to your listeners. And a lot of people think about communications from the perspective of audience. I don't like that word. The reason I use listeners is because your goal is to be understood. Your goal is to speak in a way that listeners can understand you, that they want to listen, and that they trust you enough to listen to you. So how do you do that? Here's where the choosing of words comes in. Pick words that are common, concrete, and conversational. We say things like mitigation and induced seismicity all the time, but most of the people we talk to don't swim in that pool with us. Those aren't their words. So you have to think about what words will be common with them. And there's a big difference between saying create an earthquake and saying induce seismicity. Give me something concrete. Most of us can think about what renewable energy is, but why not say wind and solar? It's just so much easier. You want to help translate for people so that they don't have to use any more of their brain space to stay with you, to follow you, to listen to you. And that's why being conversational makes all the difference. So sometimes, especially for those of you who are in graduate school, you know, you're speaking in a way
Amy is frozen.
Thank you. I was just wondering if it was only for me. Let me reach out and see if I can have her pick up where she left off. Just a moment.
I think we can get to someone else and then start her again later.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best solution. Yeah.
I think probably we could introduce our next panelist, and of course, Ms. Ains, when she joins, she can go with her, remaining. Privileged to introduce Celeste Renaud. Celeste is currently in South Africa as the investment analyst at Meridian Economics. I met her when she was a graduate student at the University of Oxford. As I like to say, University of Oxford is maybe one of the most beautiful universities in the world after UVA, of course, just kidding. Celeste works in just transitions, and so she'll tell us not just about what just transitions are in the spirit of equity, but at the same time, talk about how we can communicate the intricacies of just transitions from communities and industry and governments and different stakeholders. So Celeste, please take the floor.
Thanks very much, Udayan. Can everyone hear me? All right.
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, no, I think, so when reading about the topic of this particular session, was so exciting to me, as based on the space in which we work. So as Udayan mentioned, I'm at Meridian Economics, which is a climate and energy consultancy. We are often operating at the interface of quite technical, analytical, power system and financial information, but also at the policy decision-making space. And what we find is that there is often a tension between bridging information across in a way that is technical enough, there is enough technical rigor to enforce the credibility of the work, but as Amy and Dr. Parikh were saying, that it is simple enough to be tangible and digestible and to be relevant to the policy decisions that need to be made. So to go to the concept that Udayan just mentioned, which is that of the just transition, So what are just transitions, and why should we be looking at them in the context of our, our global climate and decarbonization agenda? So just to take a step back, the just transition concept is one that originated in the trade union movement, and has come to represent the need for a range of socioeconomic interventions that should ensure that no one is left behind as we move towards decarbonizing our economies. And this has particular significance for fossil fuel workers and communities who are dependent on fossil fuel type activities, which will need to be phased out in order for us to reach our climate goals. For example, that of reaching net zero emissions by the mid of this century. So it's a relatively easy concept to explain at face value, but what we find is that depending on which context people find themselves in, whether it's country or different communities, just transition can mean very different things. And therefore the direct needs for implementing a just transition could be quite different. So for example, the need for a just transition in Canada, which has strong state support capabilities, there's a well-mobilized labor force, strong existing worker support mechanisms, looks quite different to the needs of a just transition in South Africa, where we have quite a dynamic migrant labor system. We have a very large informal coal economy in relation to coal production and use. We have less resources and capabilities from local and regional government perspective, and super high broad unemployment levels. We're sitting at about 35% at the moment, and that's not even including those who have been discouraged and just stopped looking for work. And so there is this whole emerging space on trying to understand what context-specific just transition needs are in relation to different national policies that are committing countries to decarbonize, but also what are the learnings that we can draw from different contexts. So for example, what can South Africa learn from Germany's transition? What can we learn from India's proposals, et cetera, et cetera. And just to emphasize the point on communication is that without having a consolidated idea about where we're going and finding a common language and a common consensus amongst stakeholders, whether that's business, government, labor, civil society, who all have quite different ideological positions, it's actually quite difficult to get action spurred. And South Africa in particular has taken quite a long time to build consensus on what this process might look like. And that's been quite a large sticking point in our decarbonization goals. So so the second component is, what are some effective strategies to communicate just transition needs and consolidate ideas? And I think in many ways, this is an evolving space and still a lot to be learned. But what we have found is a lot of this is around building consensus through the use of focal points. So what we basically just do step back. So there are these multiple meanings of a just transition, but there is a real need to get action going. So in South Africa, we are in an energy crisis. Our coal-fired power dominant system is falling apart. We have rolling blackouts. We have the highest unemployment levels on record, and there's a lot of pressure on us to decarbonize very soon because we have a very carbon intensive economy. I think we're in the top 20 in the world. But also stuck in this ideological debate about we have to figure out what to do in terms of the just transition before we move forward. And so there's some really awesome work that's being done in South Africa by various stakeholders. And one of these key sort of areas has been on focus points. And I'm just going to share a quick slide, if I can. Please feel free to stop me if I'm going over time. There we go. So this is just a very, very simple slide but it emphasizes this point about focus areas. And what, so just to go back to the South African context, we have this very, very urgent need to fix a lot of developmental problems in our country. And therefore, the just transition concept itself stems a lot broader from just supporting, for example, in this circle over here, the focused transition, supporting directly, that's one layer of a just transition, is the focused support to workers and communities in fossil fuel dependent regions, and ensuring that there are enough green economic opportunities that are created in order to facilitate this transition in a supportive way. There is also in a layer up from this concentric circle, there is a just transition as a national economy-wide transition, which is a more fundamental shift of the economic system, which targets socially inclusive outcomes. And that's kind of where we're sitting in South Africa at the moment. We have a lot of shifting to do. And then more broadly, there's just transition as a broader systemic transformation, which is essentially about changing our global system in order to make it more fit for purpose in a climate compatible world. So there are all of these layers to just transition, but bringing it back to the area of focus points is that there's an urgent need to get things going. So where do we start? How do we get the conversation going, and how do we build consensus? What we found is really useful is to start in one focus area. And just before I wrap up, and what that means is basically highlighting a particular area whereby acknowledging that the space is much more complex and wider than one can than is encompassed in that particular area, but using that point. So for example, a focused transition in a specific coal region to start having these conversations and engaging different stakeholders with different ideological views around what can we do on that particular focus area. And it's been quite amazing to see how much consensus and how many converging ideas actually exist in that space. Yeah, I think I'll stop there, but we can definitely carry on in the Q&A if that's helpful.
Thank you for those comments. Wonderful. We will move on to our final speaker. I do not see Amy back in the room yet. She had a network crash. So we will move on to our final speaker, Sarah Lazarovic. Sarah Lazarovic is a creative director, writer, and marketing strategist. Throughout her career, she has worked with nonprofits, city agencies, and environmental organizations towards positive change through behaviorally informed marketing. Among other ongoing roles in media, she writes a weekly undepressing climate newsletter called Minimum Viable Planet. Welcome.
Thanks, Linnea. I'm gonna say hi, everybody, and it's so nice to be here, and it's been so great to hear the other panelists speak. I'm a pretty visual person, so I'm going to go right to my slide deck, and let's see if it actually works. Now I can't tell if it's working. Can someone let me know if if you can see my slides, Linnea?
Yes, it just popped up.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so here we go. Yeah, so I loved the question put forth to all of us panelists here on how we can balance accuracy, relevance, hope, and urgency when communicating about climate, because that is the nut of the issue. As climate communicators, we want to cram everything in there, and it's really not possible. So in the next 7 minutes, I'm going to try to unpack how we might get around the intense challenge of, trying to fill in knowledge gaps and convey the immediacy and importance of taking action on climate while not forsaking the scientific nuance that many of you work in. I put this comic in because having worked in climate for many, many years, this is the nut of it for me. And, you know, it's always so nuanced. It's never just one thing or the other. And it's always a mixture of hope and urgency and accuracy and everything. I think the key thing to keep in mind, and Amy touched on this a bit, is that we got to keep it simple. Most people don't know anything about climate, and that's not a value judgment. It's just the world is catching up, and most of us didn't have climate education in school. I know I certainly didn't. You know, unless you're relatively young, it's new, and even today, it's in Canada. We just had an audit, and you know, so many schools still have rudimentary climate communication at best. So, you know, there's a lack of knowledge. There's the fact that people are often willfully misinformed, as we know, by leaders, by stakeholders, by all sorts of forces in the world. And there's the fact that the answers are changing and emerging so quickly that, you know, even people who are well versed in climate often, you know, the things have changed. The things that we were told were great, like recycling. I don't know why I put recycling in air quotes, but you know what I mean. We now know are not the ideal solutions. So you got to keep that in mind when you're communicating. I'm going to highlight a few of the key things. You know, confusion. What is a parts per million? What is net zero? Similar to what Amy said, you know, we have to speak in language that people understand, and even very knowledgeable people, you know, have trouble catching up and staying abreast of the lingo. What does it mean? What are these acronyms? What are GHGs? It's a lot. Beyond that, carbon literacy is really low. Like how do we communicate climate when people don't really know how much various things emit? You know, we know that people often think recycling is the most effective way they can combat climate change, akin to not taking a flight across the Atlantic. You know, anyone who works in climate knows that the emissions there are negligible when it comes to recycling, and you know, tons when it comes to air travel. But you know, people don't have that carbon literacy because it's not widely available. They're supposed to factor in all of these myriad things in a complete knowledge vacuum. So, you know, we don't have carbon labels on products yet. We want people to sort of hazard a guess as to which product is better. It's just too much to do. And I know there's some behavioral scientists in the room, you know, it's choice overload, it's decision fatigue. We have to simply convey things that people can do that they will be able to understand and wrap their heads around. So one other thing, a problem I think in community climate is often the solutions are asymmetric. The problem is huge and unfathomably overwhelming. And then we say, go vote, or, you know, don't use this plastic straw. And, you know, even people who are not extremely knowledgeable in climate know enough to understand that these things don't compute. And, you know, the science is emerging to the point where now we know better to communicate more meaningful things. But, you know, I think the thing I rail against most is communicating actions that are not up to the challenge before us. And that's a recipe for climate communications failure, in my humble opinion. So what I say, enter behaviorally informed climate communications, because for me, you know, what does this mean? It means we need to understand who we're talking to. I mean, this is the basis of all communications. It's not just climate, it's everything, right? You know, you want to convey things simply, clearly, concretely, as Amy said, because you know, your message is not going to land if the person you're talking to has no idea what 450 parts per million means or what a GHG is. So, you know, keep in mind, who are you talking to? What do you want them to know? And how can we convey this information accessibly? And as Linnea mentioned in my bio, you know, I write a climate newsletter, but that's directed to a very distinct kind of climate audience, sort of a pretty climate aware, eco-anxiety laden group of individuals who are at least, you know, fairly well versed in the science. In my day job, I work in the weeds of climate policy for a Canadian climate policy organization. And the way I would talk about things there, again, is very different. It's, you know, weedy policy stuff about border carbon adjustments and things, because it's a different language. And, you know, even on the platforms I work on, I communicate differently. On Instagram, it's more lighthearted and cheeky. So I think about who you're talking to, where you're talking to them, and what you want them to know. So, oh, I just did that. Sorry, I did the last slide first. Yeah. Oh, here, and this kind of touches on what Celeste is saying. You know, in Canada, we have a lot of talk about just transition, which the population is almost fully supportive of. Poll after poll indicates that people care about a just transition. Poll after poll also indicates that they hate the phrase just transition. They don't understand what it means. And even if they support all the policies ensconced within the policy directive, they don't like this phrase. So, you know, there's been testing around what actually works. And we know the clean energy transition and the clean energy transformation tests a million times better. It doesn't get in all the different social dimensions, but those are, we know through polling, things people support anyway. So it's just constantly looking for the ways to pitch things so people will understand what we're even talking about. I like little charts that help people just consider their individual actions. So I'm running out of time here. I see I'm at 6:30. So I'll go through these very quickly, but I just try to give you a few examples here of little things that try to upend conventional thinking. You know, we often consider the before life of an object, but very, very infrequently do we consider its afterlife. I like to create lots of charts about systemic change, because I think the constant debate in climate communication circles is, you know, when to talk about individual action and when to talk about systems change. And, you know, as anybody who works in the field will tell you, it's both and, you know, we need everything. But I think a challenge for people is wrapping their heads around the systems we need to reform. I do a lot of charts around, you know, turning that despair and eco-grief into action, finding ways to communicate to people that the antidote to despair is action. To answer, I think it was Kat's question about hope. And one thing I really think is key and is often so missing from the climate discourse is humor. So I realized I did the Canadian spelling, forgive me, Americans among you, is making sure that, you know, you try whenever possible to add a bit of levity to what you are trying to convey. So two of the questions posed to me by, I believe, Lynn and Kat are, what roles do creativity, justice, and their interaction have in the climate movement? I think one of the most amazing things is that, you know, people see these things as add-ons, you know, creative protest by XR. Oh, I'm almost at time, I'm gonna go really fast. The point that I want to say here is just that we need these people to shift the Overton window. The people at the leading edge of creative ways of pushing forth the discourse and throwing out interesting ideas are the ones that help push that window and make it more palatable and expand the range of discourse, the range of opportunities, and the things we can talk about and take action on. And you can look to the youth movements of the past years to see that, you know, they broadened the discourse and pushed action so much further than it would otherwise have been. So their role is, their importance is, I can't even say enough. And then if almost all our climate decisions are made by white men, should we tailor our messaging to them, was another one, which I thought was great. Unfortunately, I think the answer is yes. You know, when you're working in those circles, if I'm communicating to a sea of top tier white male decision makers, the language and the way I dress, the way I present, the words I use, everything will be different. And when I'm talking to people with less power and more desire to change things, my language again might be different. And I think this all ladders up to the point that I made earlier, that, you know your audience and communicate in a language that they'll understand. I'm out of time, so I'm just going to stop. But I think the one thing I can leave you with is, I'll say this one is, you know, always offer action at the end of anything you say, because giving people a whole bunch of climate information with nowhere to go is a recipe for despair, disaster, and not success. And I think if you can reframe the window to the importance of taking climate action right now and the wonderful gift it is to be alive at this moment where it matters so much, then do that. Okay, I'm well over time, so thank you so much. How do I stop sharing? Thanks, Maggie, for sharing.
Thank you so much for those comments. So fun to see the cartoons too. I'm going to turn it back to Amy, whose network has uncrashed.
Oh, my. Thanks to my husband who sprung to action for me, my favorite scientist. Okay, I'm not exactly sure where I lost you, but I want to make just a couple of key points because I know we want to interact here and I think that'll be great. I was starting to talk about the idea of clearing the runway. So just imagine if you get on a plane and there's a box in the way, or a tree in the way as you're taking off down the runway. You're going to lose people if you start talking in a way that they can't understand you. So it's very important when you begin any conversation to be relatable, to recognize, just as Sarah was saying, that you have to make a connection to the people who are listening to you. And in order to be successful in the way that you interact, anytime you talk about climate, really anytime you talk about anything important, you need to be relatable. So what does that mean in terms of communication? It means starting with the essence, the big picture first, providing meaning so that people can anchor to what you're saying, and layering in details in a hierarchical way that attaches to what you've started telling them. So it all makes sense, and doing it slowly and checking to see if they're with you. It's harder to do in a situation like this where you're on Zoom, but if you can be face-to-face in a conversation with somebody, you can certainly pay attention to their nonverbal responses, get a sense of whether they're tracking with you. I always recommend using questions to check in with people and try to understand where they're coming from. The more you can learn about the people you're speaking to in advance, the more you can tailor what you say. And for all of you who are working in this field, I encourage you to be as collaborative as you possibly can with one another. Share your best ideas. It's important to take what you're learning today and bring it forward in ways that you can individually make an impact. And the last point that I want to make is this. As I've watched my husband, who's a climate scientist and my co-author of Championing Science, work in his world over the last 10 years, it's become much more important for him to learn how to build trusted relationships, to communicate in ways that environmental justice organizations will listen, to inform policy decisions. So all of you, please invest time in building your communication skills. It will make a huge difference in our collective ability to solve this problem. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ms. Ains. Really nice presentation. And I definitely recommend everyone who is in this panel to read Ms. Ains' book, which she has authored, as she said, with her husband, Dr. Roger Ains, who's a giant in our national lab system. So I think we are running a little late. So I will now open the floor to the audience, unless the panelists themselves have some pressing questions. So please raise your hands on Zoom if you have a question, and we will unmute you, or you can put your question in the chat box. If you run into issues raising your hand, that's please, I think Alfonso has their hand raised, so please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi everybody, thanks for those talks. That was amazing. I'm glad to get to attend it. I am a PhD candidate at Old Dominion in Northeast USA, Norfolk, Virginia. And I'm also part of the organization that LINEA is, Virginia Science Community Interface. So the question is related to this. There's like a hot topic right now in the organization about whether or not scientists should be doing advocacy. And more than that, it's like what level of advocacy we should be doing, like to the extreme of like, just to put it in two extremes, like to the extreme of like on the ground type of work, or should we stay in the like, let's put the papers, the science together and we create white papers or like some form of report and other people can use it for advocacy. So I just wanted to know your opinions in that type of thing. Thank you.
I welcome any panelist who wants to take that question. I think the question for those of you who might not have heard is whether or not scientists should be engaged in advocacy work, and to what extent that advocacy work should be, if yes. Please go ahead, Ms. Ains.
I'm happy to share some of my initial thoughts. I think it's a personal decision about where your passion lies and the amount of time and commitment you can make to it, especially if you're still in school. But I also think it's a powerful choice. And if you're at all inclined to step out there, you can feel the joy of knowing that you're helping more people understand the problem. And I think if we can get more voices to help more people talk to the politicians and say, we need to do this. It's time to take responsibility. It's time to get creative. I mean, we have solved so many big problems in our country, and it comes from the energy and advocacy that you're speaking about. So I encourage you to step up.
Other questions?
I have one quick reflection on that. Just so it seems that in the academic space, there has increasingly been a trend towards translating quite technical journal articles into policy relevant briefing notes, which I think is a really cool opportunity for potentially someone that is very embedded in the academic space, doesn't necessarily see themselves as, you know, going out and being an activist on the streets, you know, that's a very different world. But the importance of putting out information that's not in journal language, that is in normal people language, is one that is becoming, it's really cool to see this trend emerging, that there's this emphasis on needing to translate journal articles into, maybe it's 10 key messages for policymakers based on this study that was done. And I think that's something that a lot of academics could contribute a really important part in.
Excellent suggestion. I totally agree. And it brings up one other thing I wanted to talk about, and that is that part of what you can convey is hope, because I think we understand a lot of the science, and I think there are solutions that need to be scaled in order to really solve this problem. And I think that it's important to start to quell that fear and to get people to recognize that we've figured this out. They don't need to know exactly how. They don't need to understand what the greenhouse gas is. They don't need the details. They don't need the precision. You as scientists need it. What they need is the impact. They need to know that there is a way to solve this, but it does require us to come together both as individuals and as a collective. So I think part of what advocacy means right now that is missing is conveying the hope that science can solve this, and that there are many people who are committed to making that happen. So it doesn't always have to be a technical message that you deliver. The message of hope is important.
Can I add something to it? I think many people who are, consider advocacy as a kind of a shrill one viewpoint argument that some people are putting. And if you get that kind of impression that you are always harping on the same theme, then people would really stop listening to you. I think it's better that a scientist makes a reasoned argument, but they have to communicate. They must persuade and they must make people believe in what they've done. And that can be done only if you take the trouble to simplify things, to promote and to reach as large an audience as possible.
I would like to add, I think one of the best ways you could really communicate as a scientist to a general audience is what I've seen, with Dr. Parikh. He used to bring out India development reports, just very common language, commonplace language, very high level information on really deep issues. So IPCC reports are another great example, which are written at a college freshman level, which communicate the best in the science. I think we can move on to another question if you have one. Daniel Smith, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for your talks. I had a question because it was touched on a lot about tailoring how you're talking to your audience, to your listeners, and I really see how that works on a local scale. So whether that here in the United States for specific states, or even nationally for some other places, how you talk to somebody, you mention climate change or global warming, and they instantly check out because those terms are politically kind of motivated to some people. But the same person you mentioned, that barrier island you're kind of living on right now may be gone in a few years. It's a different story because you're tailoring it to who they are and their interests and investments. So on a local scale, I truly see the power in that. But I wonder if I get your all's thoughts on how that kind of scales globally. So how can you take these communication skills and working in this policy realms for nations that have very different interests, very different ideas, very different things going on that one person from the other area wouldn't really understand. And how do you kind of scale that communication to make these global initiatives, these global policies to actually commit to change that's needed on like these really large scales rather than just these local scales?
In a sense, that was the issue I had raised, that local scale adaptation, etc., you can do it very easily. But when it comes to global scale, you have to persuade people who don't want to be persuaded. I may ask the US experts as to say, how do you persuade Trump and his his followers that climate change is a real issue?
Well,
I'll
go ahead. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
I think it's a great question. I think you've hit the local aspect, the nail on the head, and you understand completely that, there's many who've written about this, Catherine Hayhoe and others, just on finding the right local messaging to work with your audience, telling relatable stories, grounding it in individual experience, using empathy. I think where it gets dicey is the broader implications of like, is there a global message? Is there ever a global message that you would have to convey? Because in all likelihood, the messaging is very different. The global South and the global North are going to have you're going to have very different messaging. The asks are very different. And even at that very top level, there's some great literature coming out from people like John Marshall, who is the guy behind this amazing group called Potential Energy Coalition. And, one rallying cry you hear around the world, for example, is 1.5, and he's just done a study that has tested people in countries across the world, and that doesn't land at all. So this idea that there's this one message. What does 1.5 mean? Most people don't know what 1.5 degrees means. Some people will live in Celsius, some people live in Fahrenheit. 1.5 doesn't really sound like a lot. Like nothing about it lands with anybody anywhere. So this is a back into the question backwards. I think we know what doesn't work globally, but I think there are very few things that do work globally, because I think climate change is always decided at the local level, even if the implications are global, and even if emissions globally affect us all. You're changing one person's mind who lives somewhere, and that person is going to be motivated by individual things that they see around them, as opposed to, these global factors. And at the national level, again, they may be motivated, but we don't see that people, lots of messaging around, for example, Canada being a huge emitter, and the US too, and we should pay our share. Doesn't really land. People sort of know that, but like even at that level. So I think the messaging that really works with people is the messaging you spoke about at the beginning of your question, getting them in the door with the local understanding of what's happening around them and how that ladders up to systemic change.
You didn't answer my Trump question. About Trump and his followers, how do we persuade them?
If you're posing, I don't know, honestly. Yeah.
I think we could move on to the next question. Maybe if you could again raise your hand or put your question in the chat box. I guess I can ask a question, which is close to the COP26 that just happened. There was a huge discussion between, whether we should use coal phase out, coal phase down. How many of these terms, and I think all of you interact with both global and local audiences, how many of these terms which find consensus in the global level, whether it is net zero, coal phase out, coal phase down, how many of them actually have some relevance at local level, especially in industry, because it is actually the industry which has to mitigate and do things like that.
Should I answer that?
Please.
I think the Indian delegation made in my opinion, a rather mistake in insisting that phase down can be changed to phase out can be made to phase down. What instead we should say that yes, it's not just coal. We should phase out all fossil fuels. Then the shoe would have pinched on the other foot also. And people would have said, okay, no, we can't phase out fossil fuels. We will really phase down fossil fuels. And then it would have been, a more positive statement that we are not just only coal, but all fossil fuels should be phased down.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a great idea. If I would definitely suggest the audience to take opportunities to ask question of our really esteemed panel here. Otherwise, I'll keep on asking questions. We had one sort of broad question we want to ask all our audience, all of our panelists, which is how should we balance accuracy, relevance, hope, and urgency when we communicate about climate change? I think Ms. Ains mentioned about climate anxiety in a lot of people in my generation. So I think that is something we could ask, of Ms. Ains or other panelists if they want to answer that.
There is a hand raised.
Oh, yeah, Nathan, please go.
Hi.
ahead.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists. It's been great to hear from you all. One thing, I'm also speaking from the American context, and I imagine this is much broader than this, but whenever a conversation on climate change is brought up, it's the opportunity for it to be politicized, or at least to be perceived as politicized. And I find, at least for myself, and I imagine for many others, that they want to be able to see some type of data, quote unquote data, whether it be figures or a nice web page. I'm wondering from the panelists or anybody else on this, if they have like a good recommendation for a place to send people that does not require a high level of technical knowledge.
Ms. Ains, would you like to take that?
I'm not sure that I can recommend a resource, but I do think that it's part of the challenge is to make climate personal. And I think one of the things that's happening with the study I mentioned earlier is that you're starting to hear from people that it's personal, it's affecting their lives. And so when you care about the planet and you have family members that are going to be on this planet for a long time, there's a way to connect in a more personal way, but I don't have a recommended resource. I'm guessing, Sarah, you might, given the circles that you're in.
No, like you, I think it would be a bit too generalist. I'm sure there must be some out there that and I'd be happy to look around a bit. I think, perhaps the thing to do to wind back in your question and maybe put words in your mouth, before it ever gets to that heated point where someone is asking you for facts to back it up, because to me that means the conversation has sort of not gone off the rails, but people are resorting to show me what you got, I don't believe you, send me your facts. And I don't think that I don't, not that they're bad actors, but often that is where people go when they just don't want to go there with you because they know you can't just rattle off facts. You might not know, you might not be able to pull out of your back pocket, oh, hey, X, Y, Z. So the general consensus around that is if you can, before it gets there, which is super hard, you know, tiptoe into it gently and ask where they're at, like do a meter reading and say, you know, well, what do you think? You know, what are you experiencing? What do you feel? And, you know, this is me giving you the 30-second synthesis of motivational interviewing, but basically you're just trying to get a bead on where they're coming from. And often that will give you, that will point to you to where you need to go. And, you know, if they say, well, I don't really see this much happening or X, or, you know, I work in this field and here's what's happening, it will at least give you a direction to go to find some supplemental information to send to them later. Because I don't think it's ever one conversation. Like you're not going to be like, okay, I'm just going to send you this great little general report that's going to tell you all about climate change and change your mind in an instant. I mean, it's probably a conversation that's going to occur 5 or 7 more times, and you're just trying to get them to be open-minded. And I think the best way to do that when they seem like they are not quite on side and demanding those facts of you is saying, sure, I'd be happy. I want to hear where you're coming from and what you want to know, and I'll get back to you and I'll let you know, what I found on this particular thing, just to show good faith, to show that you're hearing where they're coming from and actually be able to provide a more useful directed resource. And I think it's the reciprocity principle, just showing you're there to hear what they have to say and give back goes a long way just towards weakening those defenses in the first place. And you'd be surprised.
Thank you. I think Shravan has his hand raised before the question in the chat came along. So Shravan, please go ahead.
Yeah. Again, thank you for the. Can you guys hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you for the thank you to the panelists for engaging with us. I would like to talk about a bit, or like focus a bit more on what Udayan has asked about, like the accuracy of solutions. What I like from all the lit reviews that we read and all the solutions that we read, one thing that pops up is the lack of homogeneity in solutions, or like each organization or each resource providing a different solution towards the climate impact. And that kind of, as a person who is in the field, as a person who knows about these solutions, I can see how they can be implemented. I can see how they reach the target. But as a reader who is not in the field, I would look at that as people not being able to decide what the solution is, or I, as a country, or like as even a corporation, I'd say, oh, this particular paper suits me, then why should I take solutions which are negative towards my business, or like why should I take steps which are not giving me more profit, right? So how do you get a coalescence in that solution?
Yes, I think the question basically Shravan was asking is different sort of a huge array of literature and other things have come across, and you can pick and choose basically. So how would you basically find consensus among all of the literature? I think Dr. Parikh, if you want to take that.
No, I think what really is required here is it is a very complex issue. Climate change is a complex issue. But when you are talking to people, you have to really bring down to the bare essence of it. That you can say, yes, climate change, I mean, the stock of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is causing global warming. That warming is changing patterns of temperature and hydrology around the world in different parts. So therefore, the crops that when people are growing would be less productive and they have to change something. Or when we see that the number of cyclones, number of heat waves, number of flooding incidents are all increasing, and that Arctics and Antarctics are melting. The sea level rise will do. And I think once you reduce to that the climate change is going to have this kind of an effect, then you can talk about saying, look, if this is something that 95% or 98% of the scientists agree to it, that this is the story, Then you can talk about the next step and says, what can we do? Well, first thing is clearly to make sure that you reduce your greenhouse gas stock in the atmosphere. You reduce your emissions, you postpone them, and so on and so forth. And then you can talk about something which is what is an equitable way of sharing the burden of these activities.
Thank you, sir. So I think we are almost at the end of time because it's very late in India, and it's for many of us here in the US, we have to get to our work now. I'm already 10 minutes late to work, but I think we have had a very enlightening panel here. Thank you so much to all our panelists. Again, Dr. Kirit Parikh Saab, Amy, Celeste, Sarah, and of course to our sponsors, and again to our co-organizers, Linnea, Kat, Samarth, who did most of the heavy lifting, as I said, and were the brains behind the event. I think one huge thing I personally feel in terms of climate change communication is not just speaking and presenting and things like that, but also listening to our stakeholders. I've worked with stakeholders in government system and policy, industry, and I think what they say, what kind of messages they want, what kind of metrics they are expecting is also really important. With that, I'll request Linnea to propose a final vote of thanks and also tell the audience maybe what the next steps we are looking at as a group. Linnea, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So thank you all so much for being here, to the speakers and to the audience for really insightful questions. So following this event, we're going to provide a summary of the proceedings in an article, which will be posted to the event webpage, which is, I just posted it in the chat, along with the recording for this event. So please follow up on the event webpage. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you. Enjoyable presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'll go ahead and stop the recording here.